Welcome to a story told in the quiet hours. A tale not of triumphant discovery, but of knowledge found in the dark, in the silence that follows a long-forgotten lecture, in the dust that settles on ancient, forbidden texts. It is a story of a place where ambition learned to whisper, where scholars traded the warm light of common understanding for the cold, phosphorescent glow of a truth best left sleeping at the bottom of a lake. Tonight, we will drift into the past, to the genesis of it all, to the hallowed and haunted halls of Byrgenwerth. We will walk its empty corridors and sit in its abandoned lecture halls, listening for the echoes of a secret history that forever changed the nature of man, the cosmos, and the terrible price of enlightenment. So find a comfortable rest and let the weight of this old story settle over you like a gentle fog. Imagine, if you will, a world not yet acquainted with its own insignificance. A world where the night sky was a tapestry of distant, twinkling lights, beautiful and meaningless, and the deepest mysteries of existence were confined to the pages of crumbling philosophy texts and the quiet musings of men in dusty rooms. It was into this world of comfortable ignorance that the first crack appeared, not with a raw, but with the soft, gritty sound of a shovel breaking earth. The discovery was accidental, as such world-shattering things often are. A sinkhole, perhaps, or a collapse in an old quarry revealing not bedrock, but a worked stone staircase descending into a profound and unnatural darkness. This was the mouth of the Pthumerian Labyrinth, a tomb built by a civilization so ancient they had no name in any living tongue, a city of the dead buried deep beneath the waking world. The initial expedition would have been a thing of lanterns and trembling hands, of ropes straining against the weight of the unknown. The air that rose from that opening was stale, carrying the scent of dry rot and millennia of undisturbed silence, a cold that had been waiting for an age to be breathed again. They descended, these first brave and foolish souls, not into a simple catacomb, but into an architecture of madness. The walls were not made of simple stone, but seemed to be carved from a single, impossible material, smooth and cold as obsidian, yet veined with faint, pulsing luminescence. The corridors did not follow the logic of human engineering. They coiled in upon themselves. They spiraled downwards in angles that strained the eye. They opened into vast, cathedral-like chambers, where the only light came from glowing, fungal growths that clung to pillars wide enough to support the sky. This was the beginning of the Chalice Dungeons, a network of root cellars for reality itself, where the foundational laws of the world grew thin and porous. And in the deepest, most silent heart of this geometric nightmare, they found their first resident. It was not a skeleton, not a mummy, not any relic of a king or a high priest. It was a presence, a being of such profound and alien biology that to call it a creature feels like a blasphemy. They named it Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, though whether it was a daughter, a mother, or something for which we have no word, we cannot say. She was found in a state of quiet sorrow, or perhaps a slumber so deep it was indistinguishable from grief, her magnificent, pale form anchored to the cold stone, her wings, vast, diaphanous things that seemed woven from solidified light and sorrow, folded about her like a shroud. The initial shock was not one of terror, though terror was there, a cold knot in every stomach. It was awe, a reverent, soul-shattering awe. Here was proof, tangible and breathing, that humanity was not the pinnacle of creation. Here was a divinity, but not one from any scripture. It was a flesh and blood God, weeping shimmering, opalescent tears. And in that chamber, surrounded by the impossible, the first whispers began. Whispers that would become the founding creed of a new age. They saw the intricate, otherworldly structure of this being, and they understood, in a flash of horrifying clarity, that their own perception was a prison. They saw with eyes of flesh, eyes that could only perceive the surface of things. The secret, the ultimate secret, must be to see beyond the veil, to perceive the underlying architecture of the cosmos itself. They needed eyes. Not more of the same, but new ones. They needed eyes on the inside. And so, from the profound silence of that tomb, from the quiet weeping of a forgotten god, Byrgenwerth was born. It was not founded as a mere college, not a simple institution of learning. It was conceived as a lighthouse on the shore of a new and terrifying ocean, a place where the most brilliant minds of a generation would gather with a single, sacred purpose. To gaze into the abyss that had been uncovered and to learn its language, no matter the cost. In its early days, Byrgenwerth must have felt like the center of the world. Picture a cluster of elegant, stone buildings nestled in a serene, almost pastoral landscape, surrounded by ancient, whispering trees and the gentle, lapping waters of a great lake. By day, the sun would filter through the leaves, dappling the lawns where scholars in dark robes would stroll, their voices a low, earnest hum of debate and discovery. It was a place of intense, focused energy, a sanctuary for those whose curiosity burned too brightly for the dim halls of conventional academia. They were a new breed of thinker, drawn by the siren call of the labyrinth's discovery, not treasure hunters, but truth seekers. Astronomers who found their charts obsolete, biologists who realized their taxonomies were a childish fantasy, philosophers who understood that all human thought was built upon a foundation of sand. And presiding over this nascent revolution was a figure of immense, gravitas-filled calm, Provost Willem. He was an old man even then, his body frail, but his mind a razor, his eyes holding a depth of patience that could feel like eternity itself. He was not a charismatic firebrand, but a deep, still pool of thought. Under his guidance, the initial research was meticulous, almost reverent. The primary artifact of their study was, of course, the old blood. It was not merely a biological sample. It was a scripture written in a language of life, a key to transformation. In the college's sealed laboratories, they would have studied it under lenses of polished crystal, watching how a single drop could cause plant life to writhe and mutate into new, fantastical forms, how it could heal grievous wounds in seconds. It was a substance of pure potential, a liquid argument against the very concept of a fixed state. But Willem was cautious. He understood that to consume the blood was to invite the influence of the sauce, to tether one's very being to those vast, cosmic intelligences. His path was one of internal ascension. He preached a doctrine of lineage, a concept that went far beyond simple evolution. It was the belief that humanity was not an end point, but a larval stage. That embedded within the human form was the latent potential, the lineage, of a higher state of being. The key to unlocking this potential was not in physical transformation, but in a fundamental expansion of consciousness. Insight. To him, the phrase "eyes on the inside" was a spiritual mantra. It meant cultivating a new form of perception through meditation, through the study of arcane geometries, through a slow, careful communion with the fragments of knowledge they had recovered. He would sit for hours with his students, not lecturing, but guiding them through mental exercises, urging them to fear the old blood, to respect the magnitude of the forces they were engaging with. The atmosphere was one of a monastery dedicated to a new science, a place where the rustle of parchment and the soft chant of scholarly debate were the only sounds, a world away from the eventual horrors to come. It was a fragile, beautiful time, a moment of poised potential, where the future seemed to hold only enlightenment, a gentle ascension into a higher plane of understanding. But such purity of purpose is a difficult flame to maintain, especially when fanned by the winds of ambition. And no wind burned hotter or more fiercely than that which animated Willem's most gifted pupil, a young man named Lawrence. Where Willem was a deep, still lake, Lawrence was a rushing river, powerful, undeniable, and destined to carve a new path through the landscape of their world. He possessed a charisma that Willem lacked, a fire in his eyes that could ignite the passions of his fellow scholars. He listened to Willem's sermons of patience and internal growth, and he saw not wisdom, but hesitation. To Lawrence, the old blood was not a subject for contemplation. It was a tool for action. It was the very engine of evolution, a gift left behind by the gods, and to refuse to use it was the greatest sin of all, a sin of cowardice. He argued that Willem's path was too slow, too theoretical, that while they sat in their libraries, meditating on the nature of insight, humanity continued to suffer from disease, from mortality, from the very limitations they had the power to overcome. He saw the blood as a direct conduit to the divine, a means to not just understand the great ones, but to join them to elevate all of mankind in a single, glorious, transformative act. The debates between them would have begun as quiet, intense disagreements in Willem's study, the air thick with the scent of old books and unspoken tension. Willem, from his chair, would speak in his measured, ancient voice, pointing a trembling finger not at the blood, but at the skulls of his students, urging them to look inward. Lawrence, standing, his form radiating a restless, frustrated energy, would counter with visions of a new Yharnam, a city of miracles, a civilization healed and uplifted by the very essence of the cosmos. It was a fundamental schism, a fracture in the very soul of their endeavor. The emotional rupture was as profound as the intellectual one. This was not merely a disagreement over methodology. It was a betrayal of a father by his most beloved son. The day Lawrence left was likely not a day of shouting and drama, but one of a terrible, cold silence. He would have gathered his notes, the most promising and radical of the research, and a corps of followers whose hearts he had won with his fiery conviction. They would have walked out of the grand doors of Byrgenwerth, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly hollow halls, leaving Willem and his remaining loyalists in a silence that was now filled with the ghost of what had been lost. Lawrence did not look back. He took the old blood, the research, the ambition, and he walked towards the growing city of Yharnam to found the healing church, an institution that would promise miracles to the masses, and in doing so, plant the seeds for a plague of beasts. The fellowship was broken. The age of pure inquiry was over, and in the wounded silence that Lawrence left behind, Byrgenwerth changed. The pastoral serenity curdled into something more desperate, more secretive. Willem, though he had urged caution, was now driven by a need to prove his path correct, to achieve the breakthrough that would validate his more patient, internal methods before the reckless actions of his former pupil plunged the world into chaos. The research, once so careful and reverent, twisted in on itself, becoming strange, forbidden, and drenched in a new kind of horror. The college itself could no longer contain the scope of their experiments. They spilled outwards into the surrounding landscape. The forbidden woods, once a place of tranquil beauty, became a living laboratory. Its twisting, shadowy paths were perfect for concealing things that were no longer meant to be seen by the sun. Here they began their attempts at forced evolution, at communion. The concept was audacious, blasphemous. If humanity carried the lineage of the great ones within it, then that lineage could be encouraged, hastened. The results of these experiments began to wander the woods, lost and pitiful things. The celestial emissaries, those bloated, childlike forms with heads like translucent, star-filled sacks, were perhaps an early, partially successful attempt to create a being capable of communicating with the cosmos. They were mindless, babbling creatures, their heads filled with a miniature, swirling galaxy, a tragic mockery of the insight they were meant to possess. And then there were the living failures, a name that speaks volumes of the scholar's own grim assessment of their work. Grown in the secluded astronomic clock tower, which acted as a distant outpost of Byrgenwerth's ambition, they were hulking, malformed creatures, their bodies a chaotic patchwork of limbs and fungal growths, capable of little more than a brutish, confused violence. They were failures in the most profound sense, beings that had been pushed towards the celestial, but had only achieved a new and pitiable form of mortality. But the most intimate horror was reserved for the students themselves, those who had stayed loyal to Willem. Their pursuit of eyes on the inside became a literal, physical damnation. In their desperation for insight, they subjected themselves to procedures and rituals that warped their very bodies. They became the Garden of Eyes, creatures that were once human, now scuttling on too many limbs, their skin studded and erupting with dozens, hundreds of unblinking, milky eyes. They were a walking, twitching testament to a truth taken too literally, a philosophy made flesh in the most grotesque way imaginable. They had sought to see the cosmos, and in doing so, had become a nest of sight, devoid of any mind to understand what they witnessed. And it was in this atmosphere of escalating desperation, surrounded by the chittering of his transformed students and the silent judgment of his own failures, that Willem made his final, most consequential gambit. He would use the last of his great insight not to ascend himself, but to create a bulwark. He would create a being to hold back the truth, to buy a dying world a little more time in its comforting ignorance. He would create Rom, the vacuous spider. The ritual was one of immense, self-sacrificing power, an act of cosmic surgery that took a willing, or perhaps unwilling, student and hollowed them out, filling the void with a new kind of consciousness, one that was simple, empty, and powerful enough to serve as a linchpin for a great and terrible seal. Rom was not a beast, not a kin. It was a mechanism, a blank, vacuous guardian, a living veil. The transformation was not a glorious apotheosis, but a quiet, terrible unmaking. The chosen vessel, whose name is now lost to the moss and the murk, would have been brought to the edge of the lake. The very waters that had once reflected the college's lofty spires, now serving as a mirror to a profound and final surrender. The air would have been cold, carrying the damp, organic scent of reeds and deep water, and the only light would have been the pale, fractured glow of the moon on the water's shifting surface. There were no grand incantations shouted to the heavens, no pyrotechnics of arcane energy. Willem's method was one of profound subtlety, a whispered conversation with the fabric of reality itself, a persuasion of physics and thought. He would have placed his aged, trembling hands upon the student's head, not in a gesture of blessing, but of extraction, of careful, deliberate evacuation. One can imagine the student's eyes, wide with a fear that was slowly being replaced by a vast, spreading emptiness, a draining away of self, of memory, of desire, until nothing remained but a pristine, echoing hollow. And into that void, Willem poured not more knowledge, but a single monumental directive: to be. To exist as a blank page, a silent bell, a spider at the center of a web of perception, holding the fraying threads of the world's sanity in its countless, delicate legs. When it was over, the student was gone. In its place, now resting in the silt and stillness of the lake's deepest embrace, was Rom. It was a form that defied simple description, a pale, bulbous body of soft, boneless flesh, the color of a grub that has never seen the sun. From this central mass sprouted countless, spindly legs, not the chitinous appendages of a true arachnid, but things that seemed formed of solidified moonlight and memory, delicate and terrible. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a smooth, featureless expanse, a monument to the vacuity that now defined its being. And all across its pallid skin, nestled in the folds and crevices of its form, were eyes. But these were not the desperate, weeping eyes of the Garden of Eyes. These were cold, geological eyes, like polished stones from a riverbed, seeing everything and comprehending nothing. They were the instruments of its purpose, not windows to a soul, for the soul had been scoured clean. Rom was the vacuous spider, the keeper of the seal, the great, blank anchor that held the world in a state of blessed, fragile ignorance. And with its creation, the world changed. It was not a change one could see with ordinary sight, but a shift in the very atmosphere of perception. A great and subtle pressure was applied to the collective mind of humanity, a gentle but insistent hand pressing down on the lid of a box that was beginning to rattle violently. The mensis ritual, that desperate, screaming attempt by another splinter faction to force a communion with a great one, was, in an instant, muffled. The shrieks of the mad scholars, the tearing of the veil in the nightmare of Yahargul, the bloody birth pangs of a new god, all of it was suddenly submerged, rendered distant and dreamlike, a shriek heard from the other side of a thick pane of glass. The red moon, which had been straining to descend, to wash the world in its maddening, revelatory light, was held at bay. Its crimson glow diluted to a faint, worrying stain on the edge of the night. The world, for a little while longer, could continue in its comfortable slumber. People in Yharnam could continue to fear the beasts in the streets without ever knowing that the beasts were merely a symptom of a far more profound and cosmic disease. They could pray to the healing church for salvation, never suspecting that the very blood that healed them was the vector of their eventual damnation. This was Willem's final, tragic gift to the world he had helped to unmask, a lie. A beautiful, necessary lie woven from the hollowed-out soul of his follower, a veil of normalcy draped over the screaming face of the truth. But a veil is not a wall. It is a fragile thing, susceptible to the slightest tear. And in the quiet, decaying halls of Byrgenwerth, the veil was at its thinnest. The air within the college no longer carried the scent of parchment and earnest debate. It was a heavier air now, thick with the smell of dust and slow decay, of old wood rotting from within, and beneath it all, a faint, sweet-sour odor of stagnant water, and something else, something like the ozonic tang of a gathering storm, or the cold, metallic scent of the cosmos. The grand lecture halls stood empty, their rows of wooden benches gathering a fine, gray powder of neglect. The only sounds were the groaning of the ancient timbers as the building settled deeper into the earth, the skittering of insects in the walls, and the occasional, distant, liquid plop from the direction of the lake, a sound that might have been a fish breaking the surface or something else entirely. Willem himself became a monument to his own philosophy, a figure of stone and silence. He took his permanent vigil on the balcony overlooking the lake, the very source of his great and terrible working. His body, already frail, seemed to have fused with the stone of the balustrade, his flesh taking on the same gray, weathered texture. His robes became stiff with dew and time, and the famous pointed hat atop his head was now a perch for spiders who wove their intricate, temporary webs between its brim and his motionless shoulders. His hand remained eternally raised, the fingers curled in a gesture that was neither a beckoning nor a warning, but a simple, sustained pointing. He was pointing toward the lake, toward Rom, toward the vacuous truth that held the world together. He had become his own final lesson, a statue preaching the doctrine of silence and stillness, his own mind perhaps having ascended to a plane of pure thought, or perhaps having simply emptied in a smaller, slower echo of the transformation he had wrought upon his student. He was a king presiding over a ruined castle, his kingdom a silence, his subjects the ghosts of his own ambition. And the ghosts were many. They did not haunt the halls with clanking chains or mournful wails. Their haunting was far more subtle and far more dreadful. They were the ghosts of ideas, of paths not taken, of questions that had devoured their questioners. In the overgrown gardens, one could sometimes catch a glimpse of pale, multi-limbed shapes moving through the twilight with a soft, chittering sound. The Garden of Eyes, Willem's most loyal and damned disciples, still tended to their namesake, their bodies a grotesque library of sight without understanding. They would shuffle through the overgrown hedges, their countless milky orbs staring out at a world they could no longer comprehend, their minds having shattered under the weight of the very insight they had so desperately sought. They were a living, breathing warning of what happened when one gazed too long into the abyss. The abyss did not gaze back. It simply moved in and made your body its home. In the libraries, the ghosts took the form of the books themselves. The shelves were still lined with volumes bound in strange, soft leather that felt unsettlingly like skin, their pages filled with script that seemed to shift and writhe if stared at for too long. These were the forbidden texts recovered from the labyrinth, the ones that spoke of the great ones and their cyclopean architecture, of the nature of dreams and the substance of nightmares. To read them was to feel the contours of one's own sanity begin to soften and warp, like wax held too close to a flame. The very air in the library seemed thick with the psychic residue of 1,000 frantic readings, the silent, screaming comprehension of scholars who had learned, too late, that some doors once opened can never be closed again. The dust that settled on these tomes was not mere dust. It was the fine, gray ash of incinerated minds. And below the college, in the root cellars and the forgotten, waterlogged passages that connected it to the lake, the ghosts were wet and cold. Here, the boundary between Byrgenwerth and the great, placid body of water that was its shame and its salvation was at its most porous. Moisture beaded on the stone walls, and the sound of lapping water was a constant, whispering presence. Strange, blind things with too pale skin and long, grasping fingers sometimes found their way up from the depths, drawn by some residual memory or a dim, biological impulse. They were the failed experiments, the cast-offs from the desperate days of research, things that had been pushed into the water to be forgotten, but which had not quite had the decency to die. They would cling to the wet stone, their forms barely distinguishable from the pale, phosphorescent fungi that grew in the damp, their silent, groping movements a testament to the college's legacy of creation and abandonment. This was Byrgenwerth in its final age, not a place of learning, but a tomb for a failed dream. A beautiful, crumbling shell that contained a silence which was not peaceful, but pregnant with a terrible, withheld knowledge. It was a pressure cooker of the soul, where the weight of the unspeakable truth, held back by the vacuous spider in the lake, pressed in on the very stones, waiting for a crack to appear, for a single, curious mind to arrive, and by the simple act of seeking to undo everything. The stage was set. The veil was thin. The world held its breath, balanced on the edge of a silence that was about to be shattered. The lake itself was the heart of it all, a vast, silver-black eye staring up at the sky, its surface a perfect, unruffled membrane between the world of waking reason and the churning, formless truth sleeping in its depths. By day, it reflected the passing clouds and the weary green of the surrounding woods with a placid, deceptive beauty. But by night, it became a different entity altogether. It did not reflect the moon and stars so much as it seemed to absorb them, swallowing their light into a profound and lightless hunger. On certain nights, when the wind was still and the world seemed to be holding its breath, a faint, phosphorescent glow would emanate from the deepest parts of the water, a sickly, greenish luminescence that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like the heart of a leviathan dreaming in the mud. It was the light of Rom, the vacuous one, the silent guardian, and it stained the undersides of the low-hanging mists that coiled over the water's surface like the breath of a sleeping god. To stand on the shore was to feel a profound and unsettling stillness, a silence so deep it had a texture, a weight. The gentle lapping of the water against the reeds and the aged, rotting wood of the old pier was not a soothing sound. It was the slow, patient lick of something vast and ancient, tasting the edges of the land. The air was cold and carried a complex bouquet of decay, wet rot, blooming algae, the iron tang of waterlogged stone, and beneath it all that faint, ozonic scent, the smell of empty space and cold stars leaking up from below. It was the scent of the cosmos, trapped in water, and it filled the lungs with a chilling clarity. The very ground seemed to tremble with a subaudible hum, a vibration that was felt in the bones and the teeth rather than heard by the ears, the resonant frequency of the Great Seal itself, a constant, low-grade tremor of sustained, cosmic effort. This was the atmosphere that permeated the college, seeping up from the lake through the soil and into the foundations, rising through the floorboards like a slow, rising damp of despair. The Grand Library, once a cathedral of thought, was now a mausoleum for dead ideas. The light that filtered through its high, arched windows was thick and syrupy, illuminating swirling motes of dust that were not merely dust, but the desiccated remains of ambition, the powdered fragments of shattered hypotheses. The long tables were still strewn with open books, their pages frozen in mid-revelation, the notes scrawled in the margins by long-dead hands becoming increasingly frantic, the script devolving from neat, academic cursive into jagged, desperate scratches, until they ended altogether in a final, ink-blotted scream of silence. One could almost hear the echo of that final, collective mental snap. the moment when the cumulative weight of the forbidden texts had become too much to bear, and the pursuit of knowledge had curdled into the paralysis of terror. In a forgotten corner, tucked away behind an unstable stack of folios on aquatic phantasms, a single, small desk stood as a poignant, private tragedy. Upon it rested a half-finished letter, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. The salutation began, "My dearest Ilara," but the message trailed off after only a few lines, the pen having fallen from a hand that had likely been transformed, or had simply fled into the woods to lose its mind in a more pastoral setting. A pair of wire-rimmed spectacles lay beside it, one lens cracked clean through, a tiny, frozen spiderweb marking the point of some sudden, profound shock. These were the intimate ruins, the personal cataclysms that were the true legacy of Byrgenwerth. They were not grand, historical events, but small, quiet cessations of hope, each one a tiny, extinguished star in the firmament of human potential. The gardens, which had once been meticulously maintained, had long since been reclaimed by a more vigorous and indifferent nature. But the things that grew here now were not merely wildflowers and weeds. The soil, enriched by years of strange runoff from the laboratories, and subtly altered by the pervasive, otherworldly resonance of the lake, had given birth to a new and unsettling flora. There were flowers with petals the color of bruised flesh that pulsed faintly in the twilight, and thick, rubbery vines that coiled around the tree trunks with a possessive, almost sentient grip. Most disturbing were the fungi, pale, shelf-like growths that clung to the shadows under the hedges, their undersides etched with patterns that uncannily resembled human faces locked in silent screams, or the intricate, non-Euclidean geometry of the labyrinth itself. They were a testament to the fact that the influence of Byrgenwerth's work had seeped into the very earth, changing the essence of the place on a fundamental, biological level. And through this twisted paradise, the Garden of Eyes moved like slow, sad priests tending a blasphemous shrine. Their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, their human forms almost entirely subsumed by the grotesque harvest of sight that covered their bodies. The eyes were of every kind. Some were wide and human-like, brimming with a terrible, knowing sadness. Others were small, black, and shiny like insects, seeing in 1,000 fractured directions at once. Still others were milky and blind, their surfaces clouded over with the cataracts of incomprehension. They did not speak, but communicated in a soft, wet clicking and chittering, a language of shifting lenses and trembling optic nerves. They would occasionally pause in their aimless wanderings, their entire bodies tensing as if receiving a signal from some unseen broadcast, all their eyes, dozens upon dozens of them, swiveling in unison to stare at some fixed point in the empty air, seeing a layer of reality that was forever closed to the unmodified observer. They were pitiable, horrifying, and yet, in their own way, they were the most successful of Willem's followers. They had achieved a form of sight, even if the mind behind it had been utterly annihilated by the sheer volume of the view. Up on his balcony, Willem was the still point around which this slow-motion decay orbited. His transformation into a monument was so complete that it was difficult to remember he had ever been a man of flesh and blood. Lichen had begun to creep up the hem of his stone-stiff robes, and a small, determined sapling had taken root in a crack in the balustrade near his hand. Its leaves are vibrant, mocking green against his gray permanence. His own eyes were open, but they saw nothing of the physical world. They were filmed over with a pearlescent sheen like old varnish, their gaze turned entirely inward, or perhaps projected outward through the veil to the vacuous form of his creation. What was left of his consciousness? Was he trapped in an endless, silent meditation upon the nature of the seal he had wrought? Had his mind successfully sprouted the internal eyes he had always preached of? And was he now witnessing the glorious, terrifying machinery of the cosmos in its naked entirety? Or was there nothing left but a single repeating thought, a mantra of purpose that had outlived the thinker? Hold the line. Maintain the silence. Fear the old blood. His pointed finger was the axis upon which this ruined world turned, a final, unwavering testament to a philosophy of restraint in a universe that screamed for release. The pressure in the air was not imagination. It was a tangible force, a gathering tension that made the skin prickle and the hair on the back of the neck stand on end. It was the strain of the veil, the soundless scream of reality being held in a shape it desperately wanted to escape. In the quietest hours of the night, one could sometimes hear it, not a sound, but a feeling, a faint, psychic tinnitus, a high-pitched whine of stressed dimensions. It was the sound of Rom's labor, the endless, mindless effort of containing a truth that was too vast, too terrible, too beautiful for the human world to bear. And with every passing moment, that pressure grew. The cracks were not yet visible, but they were there, spreading through the foundation of things like hairline fractures in ancient glass. It would not take a cataclysm to break it. It would take only a single, focused act of will, a curious mind armed with the right key, a drop of spilled blood in the wrong place, or simply the slow, inexorable weight of time itself, to finally cause the entire, trembling edifice to come crashing down, and let the red moon descend in all its mad, revelatory glory. The silence was not a peace. It was the drawn breath before the scream. The woods surrounding the college, once a buffer of serene wilderness, had become an extension of its inner turmoil. They were no longer simply forbidden. They were actively hostile, a living entity that seemed to breathe with a malevolent sentience. The paths, which had been carefully laid out by the first scholars for contemplative walks, were now treacherous and deceptive. They twisted back on themselves in impossible loops, or simply vanished into walls of thorny undergrowth that clutched at clothing with a spiteful, animate grip. The very trees seemed to lean in closer, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor into a perpetual, green-tinged twilight. The air here was thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the cloying, sweet scent of the strange, bioluminescent flowers that bloomed in the perpetual gloom. their petals glowing with a faint, witch-light luminescence that guided travelers only deeper into the labyrinthine heart of the woods. Beneath this tangled canopy, the remnants of Byrgenwerth's more practical experiments still wandered. They were not like the Garden of Eyes. These were things born of a cruder, more visceral science, attempts to fuse human flesh with the essence of the labyrinth's lesser denizens. Their forms were a nightmare of mismatched biology. Some had the lower bodies of giant snakes, their human torsos rising from the coils, arms ending not in hands but in venom-dripping stingers, their faces locked in a perpetual rictus of confusion and pain. Others were masses of writhing, worm-like tendrils, vaguely humanoid in shape, that moved with a horrible, slithering unity, emitting a low, gurgling keen that seemed to sap the warmth from the air around them. They were the failed attempts at creating a new hybrid lineage, creatures that embodied the violent, chaotic potential of the old blood when applied without Willem's guiding philosophy of internal, spiritual ascent. They were pitiable, yes, but also deeply dangerous, their instincts stripped down to a base-level hostility, attacking any intruder not out of malice, but out of a twisted, biological imperative they themselves could not comprehend. Deeper still, the woods gave way to the entrance of the lecture building. This place was a phantom limb of the main college, a separate structure that had been dedicated to the most advanced and dangerous theoretical work. It had not decayed so much as it had become unmoored. The schism that had shattered Byrgenwerth's unity had, in some literal, spatial sense, also shattered this building. It now existed in a pocket of nightmare, a place between places, accessible only through certain unstable portals within the woods or the college itself. To step inside was to feel the laws of physics grow soft and pliable. The hallways stretched on into impossible distances, the doors along them leading not to classrooms, but to blank walls or to dizzying vistas of swirling, color-saturated void. The air was stale and motionless, yet carried a psychic chill that seeped into the marrow. The cold of a place that had been disconnected from the warmth of the waking world for a very long time. Inside, the classrooms were frozen tableaus of interrupted revelation. At the front of one, a complex diagram of celestial orbits was still chalked upon a slate board. But the orbits had been amended over and over again by frantic hands until they spiraled into a chaotic, mandala-like pattern that hinted at a truth far more complex than simple planetary motion. In another, a preserved specimen, a small, furry creature with too many legs and a single, cyclopean eye in the center of its forehead, sat in a jar of cloudy formaldehyde, its aberrant form a quiet, shocking testament to the kind of life that thrived in the corners of the cosmos. The students who had populated these rooms were still there, too, in a sense. They were the slime scholars, their bodies transformed into amorphous, gelatinous forms, their features blurred and dissolved as if by a great heat. They retained just enough of their human shape to be tragic. The hint of a robe, the outline of a hand pressed against a windowpane looking out onto nothingness, the muffled, bubbling attempts at speech that emerged as wet, sibilant whispers. They were minds trapped in a state of perpetual dissolution, their physical forms a metaphor for the liquefaction of their sanity under the relentless drip feed of cosmic truth. It was from this place, this disconnected lecture hall of the mind, that the most audacious and damning of the later experiments were launched. While Willem sat in his stony vigil, other factions, fueled by a mixture of desperation and a reckless hunger for results, pursued a different path. They looked at the Great Ones, beings like Ebrietas, lost in her silent grief, and saw not subjects for contemplation, but blueprints for power. They asked a question that Willem would have found abhorrent. If a Great One could be found, could one be made? This line of inquiry led to the most horrific chapter in Byrgenwerth's hidden history, a chapter written not in ink, but in flesh, blood, and shattered sanity. The object of their focus became the concept of the cord. Through their studies, they had come to understand that the Great Ones, these sympathetic yet utterly alien beings, yearned for children. But their bizarre biology and their existence on a plane so far removed from humanity made this a near impossibility. Every birth of a Great One was a catastrophic event, and every one of their offspring was stillborn or lost. The scholars theorized that a link, a physical tether of immense power, was needed to bridge the gap between the human and the cosmic. This tether was an umbilical cord, a relic of a botched birth, a substance that contained the very essence of a Great One's lineage and power. To consume a third of a cord was not an act of nourishment. It was an act of grafting, of splicing one's own humble lineage onto the rootstock of a god. It was the ultimate shortcut, a way to flood one's being with the insight Willem preached of, but without the decades of patient, internal cultivation. The search for these cords became an obsession. They were rumored to exist in the deepest Chalice Dungeons, in the possession of the Pthumerian descendants who had once served the Great Ones as caretakers and midwives. Other, more gruesome rumors, whispered in the darkest corners of the lecture building, suggested that they could be harvested. That certain rituals, performed on women of a specific, sensitive lineage under the light of a pale blood moon, could induce a pregnancy of a most unnatural kind, a gestation that would not produce a human child, but a larval Great One, and with it, the precious cord. The ethical boundaries that had once, however tenuously, contained the scholar's work, evaporated completely in this frantic, final scramble for transcendence. The pursuit of the cord was a descent into a moral blackness that mirrored the cosmic blackness they sought to conquer. This frantic energy stood in stark contrast to the deepening stillness at the college's heart. The two states, the desperate, twitching activity in the woods and the lecture building, and the profound, stone-like silence of Willem and his lake, were not opposites, but two symptoms of the same terminal disease. One was the feverish convulsion, the other the cold, final coma. The college was a body in its death throes, with some parts still spasming with futile life, while the core had already begun its slow, inevitable surrender to the grave. And through it all, the lake remained the silent, patient witness. Its waters were not empty. Besides the vacuous form of Rom, other things had made their home in the lightless depths. The Byrgenwerth scholars, in their early, more aquatic-focused studies, had released specimens into the lake, and the unique environment, saturated with the residue of Rom's power and the lingering echoes of the Great Ones, had allowed them to thrive and mutate in strange ways. Pale, blind fish with luminescent lure-like appendages swayed in the abyssal currents, their forms mimicking the angler fish of the deepest oceans, but on a more grotesque, alien scale. Other things, less easily defined, moved through the murk, amorphous, jelly-like entities that pulsed with a soft, internal light, trailing long, stinging tendrils that could deliver a shock not just to the body, but to the very soul, a jolt of pure, undiluted fear. To swim in these waters was to immerse oneself in a soup of latent consciousness, to feel the cold, indifferent thoughts of the guardian spider brushing against one's mind, and to risk an encounter with the phantoms of failed experiments that had been given a second, more terrible life in the sunless world below. The pier that stretched out over the water was a splintered, skeletal finger pointing toward the center of the mystery. Its planks were rotten and sagging, many having given way entirely to the corrosive embrace of the water. To walk on it was an act of faith, each step accompanied by a groan of protesting wood and the fear of a sudden, cold plunge into the unknowable below. At its end, where the deepest water lay, the air was at its coldest and the ozonic scent was strongest. It was here that one could feel the veil at its absolute thinnest, a place where the barrier between the dream of reality and the waking truth of the nightmare was as fragile as a soap bubble. Standing there, looking down into the black, reflective surface, one was not looking at water, but at a portal. The reflection looking back was not your own. It was a version of you from a world where the veil had already broken, its eyes wide with a knowledge that would shatter the mind that conceived it. The gentle, lapping sound of the water against the pilings was a constant, hypnotic whisper, an invitation to lean closer, to peer deeper, to finally see what lay on the other side of the silence. It was the most dangerous place in all of Byrgenwerth, for it offered no monsters, no traps, only the seductive, terrifying promise of an answer to the question that had doomed them all. The whispers of the pier seemed to coalesce into a tangible presence, a cold breath on the back of the neck that had nothing to do with the wind, for there was none. The air was a perfect, stagnant medium, holding the scent of deep water and profound age in a state of suspended animation. This was the silence of a held note, a single, sustained chord in a symphony of stillness that had been playing for decades. The lake was not merely a body of water. It was a lens, a focusing apparatus for a power so vast its true form could only be expressed as absence, as vacuity. To stare into its dark mirror was to feel the edges of one's own mind begin to soften, to blur, as if the sheer weight of the nothingness below was exerting a gravitational pull on consciousness itself. One's thoughts became slow, syrupy, struggling against the tide of an immense and mindless peace that was, upon closer inspection, the most terrifying thing of all. This peace was a lie, of course, but a necessary one, woven with the threads of a sacrificed soul. The creation of Rom was not an act of magic in the vulgar, storybook sense. It was an act of supreme metaphysical surgery, a cauterization of a wound in reality itself. The chosen student, whose identity was now as dissolved as their ego in the lake's embrace, had been a vessel for a specific, resonant frequency of thought, a mind honed by years of Willem's teachings to be a perfect receiver. The ritual did not fill that vessel with power, it evacuated it. It was a meticulous, soul-scouring process of unbecoming. One could imagine the final moments of that individual's selfhood not as a violent tearing, but as a gentle, inexorable fading, like the last light of dusk, surrendering to the star-flecked blackness of night. Their fears, their loves, their memories, all the beautiful, fragile clutter that constitutes a human life, were carefully, tenderly disconnected, until all that remained was a pristine, echoing chamber, a bell with no clapper, waiting to be struck by a single, defining purpose. And that purpose was the seal. It was not a wall, nor a lock, nor a barrier of energy. It was a perception filter of cosmic scale. Rom's vast, simple consciousness did not block the truth, it rendered it irrelevant. It broadcast a signal of profound, unquestioning normality, a psychic blanket that smothered the screaming revelations of the cosmos under a comfortable, dreamless sleep. The mensis ritual, with its cacophony of tortured minds and ripped-open dimensions, was not silenced. It was translated. The desperate screams of the scholars became the distant, mournful wind in the eaves of Yharnam. The pulsating, bloody light of the nascent red moon was filtered into the gentle, romantic glow of a regular autumn moon. The beasts that now stalked the streets were seen as a terrible, but ultimately mundane, plague, a problem of medicine and militias, not a symptom of humanity's fraying connection to its own cosmic heritage. This was the genius and the tragedy of Willem's final masterstroke. He had not saved the world from the truth. He had made the world incapable of perceiving it. He had traded a horrifying enlightenment for a beautiful, functional dream. But a dreamer can be awakened, and the pressure was building. In the quietest hours, when the world was at its most dormant, the strain became audible to those with the senses to hear it. It was a sound that existed just below the threshold of hearing, a high-pitched, psychic whine like a taut wire vibrating in a gale. It was the sound of Rom's endless, mindless labor. The vacuous spider was not a passive entity. It was a dynamo, a psychic engine constantly generating the field of ignorance that protected the world. And the forces it held back were not static. They pushed, they tested, they probed for weakness. The great ones, in their alien sympathy, were drawn to the prayers of the mensis scholars, to the desperate, yearning consciousness of the healing church. And their collective attention was a weight that pressed down upon the veil, dimpling it, stretching it thin in places. Within Byrgenwerth itself, the evidence of this strain was etched into the very stone. Hairline fractures, too fine to see by daylight, would sometimes gleam with a faint, sickly luminescence in the dead of night, tracing spiderweb patterns across the ceilings of the library and the hallways. The air would occasionally grow thick and heavy, resistant to movement, as if one were trying to walk through clear, scentless jelly. And sometimes, from the direction of the lake, there would come a sound that was not a plop, but a deep, resonant thrum, a bass note that vibrated up through the soles of the feet and settled in the teeth, a reminder of the colossal, unseen mechanism operating just out of sight. The loyalty of the Garden of Eyes was a complex and terrible thing. They were drawn to Willem, not out of love or understanding, but out of a deep biological resonance. He was the source of the signal that had broken them, the focal point of the insight that had overwritten their humanity. They did not tend to him, they were oriented towards him, like iron filings around a magnet. Their constant, soft chittering was not language, but a byproduct of their perception. The sound of countless optic nerves adjusting to the shifting tides of unseen reality that Willem's presence and the nearby vale made palpable. They were living seismographs, recording the tremors of the coming collapse in the twitching of their myriad eyes. When they all swiveled to stare at the same empty point in the air, they were not seeing nothing. They were seeing a point where the veil was particularly thin, a place where the dream of reality was translucent, and the screaming face of the truth was pressed against the other side, its features distorted but horrifyingly present. The library held more than just books. It held the ghosts of methodologies. One could trace the intellectual decay of the college by the subjects of the texts left open on the desks. The early works were dense with astronomy, biology, and rigorous philosophical treatises on the nature of perception. Then came the translations of the Pthumerian glyphs, their pages filled with careful, hesitant notes that betrayed a dawning, awful comprehension. Later still were the diagrams of human anatomy overlaid with celestial charts, attempts to map the cosmos onto the nervous system. And finally, on the desks closest to the doors, as if their owners had been on the verge of flight, were the truly forbidden works. Manuals of sanguine alchemy, schematics for devices designed to measure the thickness of dreams, and frantic, ink-splattered essays on the consumption and properties of the umbilical cords. These final texts were not the product of scholarly curiosity, but of a frantic, starving hunger, the intellectual equivalent of a man tearing at the walls of his own prison with his bare hands. This hunger had physical manifestations, buried in the woods and hidden in the lecture building. In a sealed chamber, accessible only through a hidden panel in a wall of false books, was the orphanage. This was not a place for human children. It was a creche, a grim nursery where the healing church, in its earliest, most secretive collaboration with Byrgenwerth radicals, had attempted to cultivate the next step in human evolution. The results were the celestial children, beings whose forms were a heartbreaking mockery of innocence. They had the soft, rounded bodies of infants, but their heads were vast, translucent domes filled with a swirling miniature cosmos of stars and nebulae. They did not cry. They emitted a low, melodic humming, a sound that was somehow both beautiful and deeply wrong, the sound of the void itself trying to sing a lullaby. They were evidence of a belief that the path to the cosmos was through a return to a primordial state, a blank slate upon which the signature of the great ones could be written. But the slate was not blank, it was human, and the writing was a violent, distorting scrawl. They were pitiable, trapped creatures, their expanding consciousness far outpacing their physical forms, left to babble at the cosmos from within their gilded cages. The very soil of the Byrgenwerth estate was now a unique and toxic substrate. The decades of chemical runoff, spilled blood, and the slow, psychic seepage from the lake had created a terroir of madness. Plants that grew here were not merely strange. They were cognizant on a basal, vegetative level. The thorny vines that clutched at passers-by did so with a faint, predatory intent. The glowing flowers would sometimes turn their blooms to follow movement, their light pulsing in a slow, watchful rhythm. It was as if the land itself was dreaming the same terrible dream as its inhabitants, its flora becoming an extension of the collective, simmering anxiety that permeated the atmosphere. To walk these grounds was to be constantly, subtly watched by the environment itself, every leaf and blade of grass a silent witness to the slow-motion apocalypse unfolding at the water's edge. And through it all, Willem remained. His stillness was not passive. It was a focused, intense effort of will that had long since transcended the need for a physical body to express it. His mind, or what was left of it, was a single burning point of concentration, a lighthouse keeper maintaining a flame in a hurricane. He was no longer communicating with his followers, or even with the world. He was in constant, direct communion with Rom, his consciousness intertwined with the vacuous being he had created. He was feeding it his own residual insight, his own memories of what it was to think and feel, using the last dregs of his humanity as fuel for the engine of forgetting. His pointed finger was not just a symbol, it was a conduit. The very will that held the veil in place flowed through that petrified gesture, a silent, unending command to the universe. You will be normal. You will be quiet. You will forget. The lichen on his robes, the sapling in the stone, these were not signs of neglect, but of a deeper integration. He was becoming part of the landscape, his humanity dissolving not into madness, but into a final, absolute unity with the purpose he had chosen. He was the college and the lake and the spider and the seal. He was the silence itself. But silence, by its very nature, begs to be broken. The pressure in the air was now a constant, physical sensation, a tightness in the chest, a feeling of imminent thunder. The hairline fractures in the architecture glowed a little brighter each night. The humming from the lake's depths grew a fraction more resonant. The garden of eyes had become increasingly agitated, their chittering rising to a frantic, skittering crescendo at unpredictable intervals. all their eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on a horizon only they could see. The stage was not just set, it was trembling. The actors were in place. The silent, stony king, his vacuous, dreaming guardian, the chittering, sightless chorus, the twisted, forgotten experiments in the woods. All that was missing was the catalyst. A single, curious mind, a drop of pale blood, a key, physical or metaphysical, that would fit the lock of this fragile, trembling world. The silence was a held breath, a string drawn back on a bow, a note sustained at the very edge of shattering. It was waiting. It was waiting for you. The catalyst, when it came, would not arrive with the blare of a hunter's horn or the crackle of arcane fire. It would be a subtle thing, a quiet intrusion, like a single drop of ink falling into a glass of clear water, its tendrils slowly unfurling to stain the whole. It would be a question asked not with words, but with presence. A consciousness, sharp and seeking, stepping onto the creaking floorboards of the main hall, its mere attention a pressure on the worn grooves of the wood, a disturbance in the dust-laden air. The college, in its profound senescence, was hypersensitive to such disturbances. It was a spiderweb waiting for a fly, every strand tuned to the slightest vibration. The main hall was a cavern of forgotten grandeur. A grand twin staircase swept upwards into darkness, its once polished banister now dull and scarred. Between them, a massive, faded tapestry depicted the founding of Byrgenwerth, though the threads had rotted in places, leaving gaps in the narrative. A scholar's face erased by time, a segment of the labyrinth's map consumed by moth holes, making the story it told a fragment, a riddle missing its key pieces. The flagstones underfoot were uneven, worn smooth by generations of scholarly feet. But now they were cold and damp, a perpetual chill rising from the earth below, as if the ground itself was exhaling the lake's breath. The air here was a library of scents. The dry, sweet smell of rotting paper, the pungent aroma of old wood preservative that had long since failed in its duty, and underneath it, that ever-present, cold metallic tang, like licking a battery, the taste of active, dormant power. A new sound would begin to echo in this space, one it had not known for a very long time, the sound of footsteps. Not the slow, shuffling drag of the Garden of Eyes, nor the frantic, skittering pace of a small, mutated creature, but the deliberate, measured tread of a visitor. Each footfall would be a small, localized earthquake in the profound silence, causing dust to shiver from the high, vaulted ceiling in delicate plumes that caught the weak light filtering through the grime-caked windows. The sound would travel through the stone, down into the foundations, where the blind, pale things in the wet darkness would pause in their aimless groping, their headless forms tilting as if listening to a forgotten language. It would travel through the floorboards into the root cellars, where the phosphorescent fungi would pulse a little faster, their ghostly light beating in time with the intruding rhythm. It would travel outwards through the soil into the forbidden woods, where the snake men would cease their patrols for a moment, their human torsos twisting as they sampled the air with flickering, forked tongues, tasting a scent that was neither beast nor kin. And it would travel upwards to the balcony, where the stone-like form of Willem would remain motionless. Yet the air around him would seem to grow denser, more focused, as if his petrified consciousness was turning with infinite slowness toward the disturbance. This visitor, this unwitting catalyst, would see the college not as a place of history, but as a corpse laid out for autopsy. Their eyes, still conditioned to the logic of the waking world, would register the decay, the neglect, the overt signs of abandonment. They would see the shattered panes of glass in the library windows, the piles of fallen plaster, the scorch marks on a wall from some long ago, contained laboratory accident. They would mistake these for the truths of the place. They would not yet understand that the real horror of Byrgenwerth was not its state of disrepair, but its state of unnatural preservation. That it was not falling apart so much as it was being held together, frozen in this moment of agonizing tension by the sheer, vacuous will of the thing in the lake. The dust was not a sign of death, it was a shroud. The silence was not emptiness, it was a lid on a boiling pot. Their journey through the halls would be a descent through layers of failed understanding. They might first be drawn to the libraries, to the promise of answers held in ink and parchment. They would pull a volume from a shelf, its cover cool and strangely supple, and the leather would seem to cling to their fingertips for a moment before releasing its grip. Opening it, they would find script that was not merely foreign, but actively resistant to comprehension. The glyphs would not sit still on the page. They would writhe at the periphery of vision, arranging themselves into shapes that hinted at terrible geometries before dissolving back into chaos when stared at directly. The knowledge within was not inert. It was a sleeping virus, and the act of reading was the needle that would inject it directly into the mind. They might feel a sudden, sharp headache behind their eyes, a pressure building in their sinuses, as their brains struggled to create a new category for the information it was receiving, and failed. Driven from the library by this psychic discomfort, they might seek the open air of the gardens, only to find no respite. The twilight here was a palpable entity, a green-tinged gloom that clung to the skin like wet silk. The sighing of the wind through the twisted branches was not a natural sound. It had a cadence, a rhythm that almost formed words, a sibilant, whispering litany that spoke of roots drinking deep from tainted soil, of branches yearning towards a sky they were no longer permitted to truly see. The garden of eyes would observe this new presence from a distance, their collective gaze a physical weight. They would not attack, not immediately. They would simply watch, their hundreds of unblinking eyes recording every twitch, every hesitant step, every confused glance. They were studying the visitor not as a threat, but as a specimen, a data point, a potential new member for their sightless, sight-filled congregation. And all the while, the pressure from the lake would be growing, responding to the fresh consciousness moving through its sphere of influence. The visitor would begin to feel it as a low thrum in their bones, a vibration that was felt in the fillings of their teeth, a subsonic hum that was the anthem of the seal. They might find themselves drawn, almost against their will, towards the source. The path to the lake was not marked, but it was the only one that felt truly clear, the only corridor not choked with debris or psychological resistance. It was a path of compulsion, a funnel guiding the curious toward the heart of the mystery. The air would grow colder, damper, the ozonic scent strengthening until it was all they could smell. The scent of a void that had been given a taste of water and stone. The sound of their own footsteps would be swallowed by the oppressive stillness, until the only sound was the slow, rhythmic lap of water against the shore. A sound that was less a sound and more a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the vacuous guardian. They would step out onto the rotting pier. Each groan of the wood under their weight would be a blasphemy in the sacred silence. The planks, slick with algae and decay, would bow precariously, threatening to plunge them into the black, reflective water. And to look into that water would be the point of no return. The surface would not show a perfect reflection of the sky. It would be too dark, too still, a sheet of polished obsidian. Their own face, looking back up at them, would be distorted, its features elongated and blurred, the eyes too dark, the mouth a grim line of unknowing. It would be a premonition. A glimpse of what they might become if they peered too deep, if they learned the truth that Rom so diligently hid. That the face of humanity was a mask, and behind it was something far older, far more terrible, and infinitely more vacant. From his balcony, Willem would be a distant, stone sentinel. The visitor might glance up and see him there, a stark silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. They would not see the immense, silent effort, the torrent of will that was being channeled through that petrified form. They would see only an old man turned to stone by his own failure. They would misunderstand completely. They would see a monument to dead ambition, when in truth he was the anchor for the world's fragile dream. His raised finger pointing toward the lake would seem like an accusation or a plea. It was neither. It was a direction. An invitation to see the instrument of their salvation, and to understand, in the final, shattering moment of insight, that salvation was indistinguishable from damnation, and that the only thing more terrifying than the truth was the beautiful, necessary lie that kept it from them. The catalyst was here. The silence, which had held for so long, was now a thin sheet of ice over a bottomless black ocean, and a single heavy footstep had just landed upon it. The first hairline crack was already spreading, silent, invisible, and irrevocable, racing from the shore towards the center of the lake, towards the pale, vacuous form of the spider, and the terrible, screaming truth it kept at bay. The wait was over. The unraveling had begun. The first true sound to break the silence, after the visitor's own intrusive footsteps, was not a sound at all to ordinary ears. It was a shift in the quality of the air itself, a faint, crystalline resonance that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the pier, a high-frequency vibration that was felt as a sudden, sharp coldness in the inner ear. It was the sound of the veil straining, a harmonic responding to the new, dissonant frequency introduced by a waking, seeking mind. The water, which had been a perfect black mirror, now seemed to develop a skin, a barely perceptible meniscus that quivered with each footfall, as if the surface tension was being tested by an unimaginable pressure from below. The visitor, standing at the very end of the splintered wood, would feel a profound and primal urge to step back. An animal instinct screaming that they were standing on the precipice of a world that was not meant for them. Yet a deeper, more insidious curiosity would root them in place, a compulsion woven from the same threads that had drawn the first scholars to the labyrinth. It was the siren call of the unspeakable, the gravitational pull of a truth so vast it promised to annihilate the self that sought it. Out on the water, a change began, so gradual it was almost a trick of the failing light. The faint, phosphorescent glow that had always pulsed from the depths began to intensify, not in brightness, but in complexity. The simple, rhythmic beat fractured into a cascade of interweaving patterns, like 1,000 fireflies caught in a swirling current, or the firing of neurons in a brain the size of a small sea. The greenish light began to trace faint, geometric shapes just below the surface, spirals that coiled in on themselves, lattices of impossible angles, mandalas of such intricate and non-Euclidean design that to look upon them was to feel the mind's architecture groan in protest. This was not Rom stirring from its slumber. This was Rom's consciousness, vast and simple, registering the new variable. It was a cosmic immune system recognizing a foreign body, and its response was not attack, but a display, a broadcast of its own vacuous nature, a living equation of silence made visible. To understand the display was to be consumed by it, to have one's own thoughts overwritten by its beautiful, mindless logic. Back in the main hall, the consequences of the visitor's passage began to manifest in more tangible ways. The dust, disturbed from its centuries-long rest, did not simply settle back into place. It hung in the air, swirling in the weak light not randomly, but in coherent, complex patterns, as if caught in invisible eddies and currents. It began to gather in corners, forming small, delicate structures that resembled webs or the crystalline formations of frost or the branching patterns of veins. These were not the work of spiders or moisture. They were the residue of the visitor's own fleeting thoughts, the psychic detritus of their curiosity and fear, given temporary, dusty form by the hyperresonant atmosphere of the college. Each question they had silently asked, each moment of dread or wonder, was being physically inscribed into the environment, a fleeting sculpture of consciousness in a place where consciousness itself was the most volatile element. In the library, the books began to respond. A heavy, leather-bound folio on a central table, its cover embossed with a symbol of a single, staring eye, suddenly fell open with a soft, percussive thud. The pages, brittle with age, flipped of their own accord, not in a frantic whirl, but with a deliberate, turning slowness, as if an unseen librarian was searching for a specific passage. They stopped on a detailed anatomical drawing of a human brain, but the illustration had been heavily annotated by a frantic hand. The cortex was overlaid with constellations, the cerebellum mapped with labyrinthian corridors, and along the margin, in a script that was now trembling and desperate, were the words: "The sky and the cosmos are one. The brain is a chalice. Pour the stars inside and see what grows." The ink of these final words was not black, but a rusty, flaking brown, the color of dried blood. As the visitor's influence radiated through the room, the drawn constellations on the page seemed to shimmer, the tiny dots of ink glinting for a moment with a faint, internal light, as if the idea they represented was struggling to become real again. High on his balcony, the stone-like form of Willem underwent a change so subtle it would be missed by any but the most prolonged and searching gaze. A single, fine crack appeared in the varnish-like film over his left eye. It was no larger than a hair, but it ran from the corner of his eye down his weathered cheek, a minuscule fissure in his monumental stillness. From within the crack, a faint, almost imperceptible luminescence escaped, not the green of the lake's glow, but a pale silver light, the color of a dead star. It was the light of his own immense, bottled insight, the power he had refused to consume, but now had to expend in a continuous stream to bolster his creation. The pressure of the visitor's presence was forcing him to burn a little brighter, to push back a little harder against the tide. The sapling growing from the balustrade shivered, its leaves trembling though there was no wind, as it drank from a will that was now being taxed to its absolute limit. Beneath the college, in the waterlogged passages, the blind, pale things began to gather. Drawn by the vibrations and the shifting psychic tides, they pulled their slick, cold bodies from the water, clustering in the darkness just below a rusted grate that opened into a ground floor hallway. They did not claw or scratch to get in. They simply pressed their featureless faces against the cold iron, their bodies piled together in a silent, waiting heap. From their forms, a low, collective humming emerged, a sound that was the antithesis of the celestial children's melodic tones. This was a dull, resonant drone, the sound of base matter yearning for a shape it could never hold, a biological echo of the formless void that existed outside the veil. It was a sound of hunger, not for flesh, but for the coherence and consciousness that the visitor possessed, a thing they had long since lost or never had. And in the woods, the agitation reached a fever pitch. The snake men, usually patrolling their designated territories in a slow, predictable rhythm, began to coil and uncoil in place, their stinger-tipped arms lashing out at the air, piercing nothing. The writhing, worm-like masses convulsed, their gurgling keen rising to a shrill, panicked frequency. The very trees seemed to tighten their grip, the thorny undergrowth thickening into impassable walls, as if the forest itself was trying to contract, to protect its terrible secrets by making itself utterly impenetrable. But it was too late. The path had already been walked. The door had been opened. The knowledge that a stranger was here at the heart of everything had spread through the ecosystem of madness like a shockwave. The catalyst was not just present. It was now fully integrated into the system. The visitor, alone on the pier, staring into the luminous, geometric depths, had become a part of Byrgenwerth's final, dying equation. Their every breath was now a variable in the cosmic calculus of the seal. Their heartbeat was a drum counting down to an inevitable conclusion. They had come seeking answers, but the college did not give answers. It only reflected questions back, amplified and distorted by the vast, empty consciousness of the lake. The truth they sought was not a thing to be known, but a state of being to be entered, an ocean to be drowned in. The first, cold droplet of that ocean had already touched them, in the psychic chill that had settled in their bones, in the faint, silver crack on a stone man's face, in the desperate, dusty sculptures forming in their wake. They were no longer a visitor. They were a symptom. The fever had broken, and the dream was beginning to sweat itself awake. The gentle lapping of the water against the pylons was no longer a whisper, but a countdown. The geometric patterns swirling in the lake's depths began to pulse in time with the visitor's own quickening heart. A synchronicity that was neither coincidence nor comfort, but a dreadful entanglement. The cold of the pier seemed to leach up through the soles of their boots, a deep, penetrating chill that had little to do with temperature, and everything to do with proximity to an absolute zero of the soul. The air itself grew thick, resistant to inhalation, each breath a conscious effort, as if they were trying to draw oxygen through a sieve of solidified silence. The ozonic scent intensified, becoming sharp enough to sting the nostrils, carrying with it the flavor of rusted iron and the cold, clean emptiness between galaxies. It was the smell of the veil's fabric thinning to a translucence, becoming a gauze through which the outlines of a monstrous anatomy could now be perceived. This was no longer a place of mere decay. It was a resonator, and the visitor had become its vibrating string. Their very presence was a note sustained in a hall built for a different, quieter music. The faint, crystalline hum they had felt in their inner ear now resolved into a discernible tone, a single, pure pitch that felt as though it were being drilled directly into the center of their mind. It was the fundamental frequency of Rom's existence, the sound of a mind so vast and empty it could only be expressed as a perfect, featureless note. To hear, it was to feel the architecture of one's own thoughts begin to simplify, to shed their complexities, their fears, their hopes, like layers of unnecessary clothing, moving toward a state of blissful, terrifying unknowing. Back in the main hall, the dust sculptures reached their ephemeral apex. In one corner, a complex spiral galaxy had formed from the gray powder, its arms perfectly defined, pinwheeling in a slow, silent rotation. In another, a miniature, jagged representation of the Pthumerian Labyrinth coalesced, its nonsensical corridors and dead ends rendered in exquisite, fragile detail. And directly in the center of the floor, a life-sized, dusty effigy of the visitor themselves began to take shape, its features blurred and generic, but its posture, the hesitant stance, the head tilted in confusion, a perfect mimicry. These were not mere patterns, they were echoes, the college holding up a mirror to the intruding consciousness, showing it the forms its own mental energy was taking in this hypersensitive environment. The effigy lasted only a moment before collapsing inward upon itself, returning to a formless heap, a prophecy of dissolution. In the library, the phenomenon escalated. The book that had fallen open now began to disintegrate, not with age, but with a sudden, accelerated fervor. The pages containing the brain chalice diagram turned a brittle charcoal black, the ink of the constellations flaring with a final, brilliant silver light before the entire page crumbled into a fine, sparkling ash that smelled of ozone and burnt sugar. The knowledge was too volatile, too alive, and the presence of a fresh mind had overloaded its fragile vessel. All through the library, a soft rustling began, as of 1,000 pages turning at once, a chorus of whispers given physical form. The leather covers of the books seemed to sweat a cold, clear fluid, and the unsettlingly soft bindings pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, as if the forbidden truths within were struggling to be born. Willem's silent vigil became a monument under siege. The single, hairline crack on his cheek lengthened, branching into a tiny, web-like pattern. The pale, silver light from within bled out more freely now, casting a faint, saintly glow across the petrified wrinkles of his face. His raised hand, forever pointing, seemed to tremble, though the stone itself did not move. It was a tremor of will, a seismic event in the landscape of his mind. The sapling rooted near his hand visibly wilted, its vibrant green leaves curling at the edges and turning a sickly gray, as the immense power it had been feeding on was suddenly diverted, pulled back into the core of Willem's being for a final, concentrated effort. He was becoming less of a man, less of a statue, and more of a conduit, a funnel through which the last dregs of human insight were being channeled to reinforce the disintegrating dream. Beneath the grate, the humming of the gathered, pale things changed in timbre. The dull drone acquired a new, sharper edge, a note of frantic recognition. They began to press harder against the iron bars, their soft, boneless bodies deforming to squeeze into the gaps, not with violence, but with a terrible, patient insistence. A thin, clear, viscous fluid seeped from their paws, coating the rusted metal, dripping in slow, steady drops onto the stone floor below. The fluid carried the same ozonic scent, concentrated, and where it pooled, the very stone began to sweat, beading with moisture that reflected the burgeoning, chaotic light from the lake. Out on the water, the display of luminous geometry reached a crescendo of silent activity. The spirals and lattices collapsed in on themselves, folding and refolding into a new, overarching pattern. A vast, perfect, and unblinking eye rendered in cold, green fire across the entire span of the lake's subsurface. It was not a malevolent eye, not a watching eye, but a simple, declarative one. A statement, I see. But its seeing was not comprehension. It was a biological function, a cosmic reflex. To be caught in its gaze was to be stripped of narrative, of history, of self, and to be registered as mere data in an infinite, vacuous field of information. The visitor, standing at the epicenter of this unraveling, would feel the last vestiges of their ordinary perception begin to slough away. The world did not grow darker, but stranger. The green light from the water began to bleed into the air, tinting the twilight, making the very atmosphere seem liquid, thick, and dreamlike. The lines between the solid pier and the fluid lake, between the air and the water, between their own body and the environment, began to blur. Their skin tingled with a sensation of being gently dissociated, of their molecules being invited to join the greater, swirling whole. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the stomach, but it was being slowly diluted by an immense, gravitational pull toward acquiescence, toward simply letting go and allowing the silence to finally, completely, consume them. This was the true nature of the secret Byrgenwerth had uncovered. It was not a monster to be fought, nor a puzzle to be solved. It was a tide, a fundamental force of the universe, which was stillness, emptiness, and a truth so absolute it rendered all questions, all struggles, all loves and fears utterly meaningless. The scholars had not unleashed a plague upon the world. They had merely glimpsed the vacuum at the heart of all things, and in their terror, they had tried to fill it with a spider. But a spider, even a vacuous one, is still a thing, a form, a presence. And the cosmos, in its infinite, silent patience, prefers the void. The pressure reached its breaking point. It was no longer a feeling, but a physical reality. The hairline fractures that had glowed in the college's stonework now shone with the intensity of captured moonlight. A network of brilliant, silver veins running through the aging mortar. The high-pitched, psychic whine escalated into a shriek that existed only in the mind, a sound that was the equivalent of tearing silk, but on a universal scale. The lake's surface ceased its lapping. It became perfectly, preternaturally still, a sheet of solid black glass. The great, luminous eye beneath it did not blink. It simply was. And in that final, suspended moment, poised on the threshold between a comforting dream and a screaming reality, everything held. The visitor, the college, the woods, the sky, all became still, waiting for the slightest push. The final, feather-light touch that would send the entire, trembling edifice of Willem's beautiful, terrible lie crashing down into the waiting, silent, and infinitely hungry truth.